The trouble began, as many things in Flaxborough did, on a Thursday afternoon that had promised nothing at all. The spring produce and flower show was in full and careful progress in the parish hall, where the air carried a mingled scent of damp coats, cut daffodils, sponge cake, and the faint medicinal polish favoured by the Women's Fellowship. Tables had been set out with military neatness. Jam jars glowed like stained glass in the light from the high windows, each labelled in a firm, moral hand. The flowers stood to attention in borrowed vases, watched over by small cards announcing their names with unnecessary precision. At the centre of it all, the Reverend Lionel Hatch stood smiling with the conscientious fatigue of a man who had shaken too many hands and admired too many marrows. He had arrived, as usual, by bicycle. The bicycle itself was not remarkable. It was black, upright, and elderly, with a bell that sounded like an apology. The vicar had leaned it against the low stone wall beside the vestry door, precisely where he always leaned it, locking it more from habit than fear. Flaxborough was not a place where bicycles vanished. They grew rusty, they fell over, they acquired baskets, but they did not disappear. Inside the hall, Mrs. Anstey was explaining at some length why her Victoria sponge was lighter than last year's, while Councillor Bream hovered nearby, pretending not to listen, and listening with great intensity. The Reverend Hatch nodded, smiled, and murmured encouragement, his mind already turning to the short address he would have to give before the prize giving. When he finally excused himself and stepped outside for air, it was with a vague sense that something was slightly out of place. The wall was bare. For a moment, the vicar simply stood there, blinking, as though the bicycle might reappear if properly invited. He looked to the left, then to the right. He even peered behind the shrub that had never concealed anything larger than a startled sparrow. The bicycle remained absent. "Oh," he said aloud in the tone one used for unexpected rain. Mrs. Peake, emerging at that moment with a tray of teacups, followed his gaze and gave a small, sharp intake of breath. "Well," she said, after a pause that suggested several uncharitable thoughts had been considered and rejected, "that is a thing." Within 10 minutes, everyone knew. By the time the prize for best chutney was announced, the bicycle had acquired a narrative. Someone had seen a youth loitering. Someone else was certain it had been moved earlier in the day, perhaps for safety. A third person recalled with growing conviction that bicycles had been a problem in Market Drainsford the previous summer, which was quite another town and therefore highly relevant. The Reverend Hatch, mortified and apologetic, insisted that it was hardly worth troubling the police. It may simply have been borrowed, he said, though he did not sound convinced. Perhaps one of the choir boys. Mrs. Anstey made a noise that closed that line of thought firmly. Inspector Purbright heard about it later in the measured tones of Sergeant Lovegrove, who took a certain pleasure in reporting matters that did not yet quite deserve police attention. "Not stolen exactly, sir," Lovegrove said. "Missing." Purbright looked up from his paperwork. He was a man who believed there was often more to be learned from what people called things than from the things themselves. "Whose bicycle?" he asked. "The vicar's." Purbright considered this. In Flaxborough, the vicar occupied a curious position. He was trusted, gently mocked, and observed with a particular closeness usually reserved for weather and prices. "Anyone upset?" Purbright asked. Lovegrove allowed himself a thin smile. "Everyone, sir?" "In different ways." Purbright nodded. A missing bicycle was nothing, and it was everything. He picked up his pen again, already aware that the small, orderly life of the town had been nudged just slightly off its usual line. Purbright nodded, and the nod served as permission for Sergeant Lovegrove to continue, which he did, with the careful relish of a man presenting a minor sensation as if it were a polite offering. They're saying it happened during the flower show, sir. Right outside the parish hall, locked up, apparently. Reverend Hatch is taking it as a personal failing. Theft does that, Purbright said. It gives people something to feel responsible for. Lovegrove looked faintly puzzled, as though responsibility had always seemed to him a thing issued by the station in standard sizes. Mrs. Anstey says she saw a lad hanging about one of those Bailey boys, likely. Councillor Bream says the hall ought to have a proper attendant. Mrs. Peake says it's a sign of the times. Purbright's pen hovered. And what does the vicar say? He says he doesn't want to make a fuss. Purbright's pen made a small mark that could have been a comma or a judgment. People who don't want to make a fuss usually do, he said mildly. Fetch your coat. They walked out into the late afternoon when Flaxborough wore his self-satisfied air of having completed another day without incident, and was quietly annoyed to discover that an incident had, in fact, taken place. The streets were damp with a recent drizzle, and the shop windows held their familiar exhibits, a row of women's sensible shoes, a butcher's display of sausages arranged with theatrical confidence, and, in the stationer's window, a stack of greeting cards waiting patiently for grief or birthdays. At the parish hall, the show was over. The prize cards had been removed, leaving only the faint impression of order on the tables and a few abandoned petals on the floor, like evidence that something had once been splendid. Outside, the low wall by the vestry door looked oddly naked. Reverend Hatch came out at their approach, his clerical collar sitting very straight above a tie that suggested it had been tied by someone who did not entirely trust knots. He was a pleasant man in the way that made people feel afterwards that they had been kindly treated, even if they could not recall exactly what had been said. Inspector Purbright, he said, with the slightly too bright smile of someone relieved to see the law and ashamed to need it. I'm terribly sorry to have bothered you. Purbright, who made a point of never appearing hurried, removed his hat. It isn't a bother, Reverend. It's my occupation. It's only a bicycle, Hatch added quickly, as if hoping the sentence might unmake the disappearance. And a very old one. I've had it since my first curacy. I suppose one becomes sentimental about such things. Lovegrove glanced at the bare wall. You locked it, Reverend? Yes. Quiet. Though I couldn't tell you why now. Habit, I suppose. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if confiding a spiritual weakness. One likes to believe one lives among honest men. One does, Purbright said. And sometimes one is right. He walked to the wall and studied the ground. It offered no heroic clues, only the usual scuffs of shoes, a bit of gravel, and a cigarette end that had been extinguished with determined impatience. Purbright crouched, not because he expected to find a dramatic footprint, but because people took crouching seriously, and seriousness had its uses. Mrs. Peake appeared from the side door, as if she had been waiting behind it for her cue. She was the sort of woman who ran parish events with the brisk compassion of a ward sister. Her apron was still on, though the show had ended, suggesting she regarded work as a moral condition rather than an activity. Inspector, she said, I said we should have had someone posted at the door. People coming and going, you see. Not that I'm accusing anyone here, but you can't be too careful these days. Who was coming and going? Purbright asked. Everyone, Mrs. Peake said with emphasis. Councillor Bream, in and out like a yo-yo. Mr. Gedge from the garage. Mrs. Anstey, of course. The children, well, they're always underfoot. And those men from the electrical shop came to look at the fuse box, though I told them it wasn't urgent. Men from the electrical shop? Lovegrove repeated, alert to the possibility that the word men might lead to suspect. Yes. 2 of them. One tall, one short. The tall one had hair like a hedge. They said the lights in the hall had been flickering. Purbright looked at the vicar. Were the lights flickering, Reverend? Hatch hesitated. I can't say I noticed. There was rather a lot going on. There always is, Mrs. Peake said. That's why things go missing. Purbright stood up, brushing an imaginary speck from his knee. He turned to the vicar again, still courteous, still mild. Reverend, does anyone have reason to be cross with you? The question landed oddly. Hatch blinked, genuinely startled, as though the very concept of someone disliking him had not been seriously entertained. Oh, goodness, I hope not. I mean, one can't please everyone. The choir complains I'm too strict. The churchwardens complain I'm not strict enough. Mrs. Larkin complains about the hymn choices. But those are parish matters. Parish matters, Purbright echoed, filing the phrase away. And does the bicycle have anything unusual on it? A mark, a bag, a loose chain, anything someone might want besides the bicycle itself? It has a wicker basket, Hatch said, brightening slightly as if glad to offer something concrete. And a small brass bell. And, oh, there was my umbrella strapped to the frame. I'd forgotten. Lovegrove frowned. Umbrella? Yes. A rather good one, actually. A gift. The vicar's cheeks coloured faintly, as if gifts were complicated. I left it there after the morning visitations. I thought it safer than bringing it into the hall and misplacing it. Mrs. Peake gave a thin sound. Umbrellas don't go missing when you keep hold of them. Purbright's gaze shifted to the door, to the wall, to the quiet lane beyond the churchyard. A bicycle, an umbrella, and a town full of opinions. Somewhere in that mixture, he felt, was a motive that would turn out not to be grand at all, but tidy and human and faintly embarrassing. He thanked the vicar, nodded to Mrs. Peake, and began to walk back towards the road. Lovegrove fell into step. "Where to now, sir?" the sergeant asked. Purbright looked down the lane, where the gravel showed a fresh line as if something had been wheeled away earlier, and then, at the cigarette end by the wall, crushed with more force than necessary. "To the electrical shop," he said, and then perhaps to whoever gave the vicar that umbrella. The electrical shop sat between the chemist and a vacant premises that had once sold hats, its window crowded with kettles, plugs, and earnest notices about safety. It was the sort of shop that smelled faintly of warm dust and old cord, and whose bell announced customers with a note of quiet reproach. Mr. Gedge looked up from behind the counter with the alert wariness of a man who had learned that inquiries rarely improved his afternoon. He was thick-set, with a permanently surprised expression, as though the world had just spoken out of turn. "Afternoon," Purbright said. "Inspector Purbright, this is Sergeant Lovegrove." Mr. Gedge nodded, his eyes already flicking to Lovegrove's uniform buttons. "If this is about the parish hall fuse, I told Mrs. Peake we'd send someone next week." "It isn't about the fuse," Purbright said. "It's about a bicycle." Gedge's expression adjusted itself. "Bicycles aren't really our line." "You sent 2 men to the parish hall yesterday," Purbright went on gently, "one tall, one short, during the flower show." Gedge rubbed his chin, which was stubbled in a way that suggested he preferred to shave only when circumstances demanded it. "Ah, that would be Wilkes and Turner. Wilkes is tall, Turner is well Turner. And they went to look at the—" "Lights," Lovegrove said. "They went to look at the fuse box," Gedge corrected. "Didn't touch anything as far as I know. Came back complaining about the cake." "Did they leave together?" Purbright asked. Gedge hesitated, then shrugged. "Turner knocked off early. Said he had an errand." "What sort of errand?" "That's Turner for you," Gedge said. "Always got errands, never got details." Purbright thanked him and turned to go. Outside, Lovegrove waited until they were a discreet distance down the pavement. "You think Turner took it, sir?" he asked. Purbright did not answer at once. He paused by the hat shop window where the dusty outlines of long-removed displays lingered like ghosts. "If he did," he said at last. "It wouldn't be for the bicycle." They walked on. The town continued its careful breathing around them. At the post office, Mrs. Larkin was telling a stranger why Flaxborough had gone downhill since the war, though she could not say which war. At the bus stop, two schoolboys argued about football with the solemn intensity of diplomats. "Umbrellas," Lovegrove said, as if testing the word. "Umbrellas," Purbright agreed. "They have a way of walking off." The umbrella in question, however, was not easily dismissed as one of the town's habitual strays. Purbright had asked the vicar, with the same polite neutrality he used for all questions, about its origin. The answer had been accompanied by a faint tightening of the Reverend Hatch's mouth. "It was given to me," the vicar had said carefully, "by Mrs. Dawkins, after her husband's funeral. He'd always insisted on walking everywhere, whatever the weather. She said the umbrella had never really belonged to her." Mrs. Dawkins lived in a narrow brick house off the high street, its front room window filled with lace and the suggestion of a vigilant presence behind it. She answered the door herself, her black cardigan buttoned high, her hair scraped back with uncompromising tidiness. "Inspector," she said, without waiting for him to introduce himself. "I wondered when someone would come." Purbright smiled. "You've heard about the bicycle?" "I've heard about everything," she said. "In this town." She led them into the front room, where the air carried the faint smell of furniture polish and something older, something that had settled into the walls. The umbrella standing by the door was empty. "You gave the vicar an umbrella?" Purbright said. "Yes," Mrs. Dawkins replied. "It was my husband's, and you haven't seen it since?" "No." She sat down with a dignity that suggested grief had become a permanent posture. "People think kindness is simple," she went on, as if continuing a conversation she had already had many times. "But it complicates things. Lionel meant well, he always does, but when you give something away, you don't always give away what goes with it." Lovegrove shifted, uncomfortable with abstractions. "Did your husband have enemies?" Purbright asked, mildly. Mrs. Dawkins gave a short, humourless laugh. "Enemies? No. He had habits. That's worse." She declined to elaborate, and Purbright did not press her. He had learned that people who wished to speak would do so in their own time, and that pressing only produced words that were not yet ready. Outside again, Lovegrove cleared his throat. "That was interesting." "It was," Purbright said, "and incomplete." They walked back towards the station, passing the garage where Mr. Dawkins had once worked, and where a bicycle, another black, upright one, leaned against the wall, unlocked and ignored. Purbright stopped and looked at it for a moment. "Sergeant," he said, "what do you make of a man who borrows a bicycle and leaves another in its place?" Lovegrove frowned. "I'd say he wasn't very good at borrowing." Purbright smiled faintly. "Or very particular." Back at his desk, Purbright made notes in a hand that revealed nothing of his thoughts. A tall man, a short man, an umbrella with a history, and a town that noticed everything except what it preferred not to see. He suspected that the bicycle had been taken politely, without malice, and that the return when it came would be equally polite and considerably more awkward. He closed the file for the day, already aware that someone, somewhere in Flaxborough, was becoming quietly anxious about umbrellas and errands. By the following morning, Flaxborough had decided, in a loose and conversational way, who was probably responsible. The decision had not been reached formally, nor had anyone committed it to paper, but it had settled into the town like a familiar piece of furniture. One could trip over it if not careful. The name most often attached to the absence of the bicycle was Turner. Turner was short, unmarried, inclined to errands, and employed only intermittently by Mr. Gedge. This alone made him suitable. He was also seen, on occasion, smoking behind the electrical shop, which added a layer of character entirely disproportionate to the habit itself. Councillor Bream arrived at the station shortly after 10, carrying his authority in the way some men carried umbrellas, upright, visible, and faintly threatening. He did not sit until invited, and even then he looked as though he might stand again at any moment if the chair proved unsatisfactory. "I won't beat about the bush, Inspector," he said. "This business is causing comments." Purbright looked up from his desk. "It usually does," he said. Bream cleared his throat. "The vicar is distressed, Mrs. Peake is furious, and there are concerns about the sort of example being set." "To whom?" Purbright asked. "To the young," Bream said vaguely, "and to the town generally. We are not a place where bicycles go missing." Purbright folded his hands. "You've decided who took it." Bream hesitated for just long enough to suggest that decision-making was a shared civic activity. "The lad Turner has been mentioned." "He has," Purbright agreed. "He was on the premises. He left early. He has no particular stake in the town." Purbright smiled faintly. "That last point is often regarded as incriminating." Bream frowned. "Are you saying he didn't do it?" "I'm saying," Purbright replied, "that if he did, it will be for a reason that interests him, not us." This seemed to irritate Bream more than direct disagreement would have done. "The council would prefer a prompt resolution," he said stiffly. "Before the matter acquires embellishments?" Purbright nodded. "Flaxborough is fond of embellishments," he said. "But it is also patient, more patient than people think." Bream left with the air of a man who had been politely delayed rather than defied, which was perhaps more unsettling. Lovegrove watched him go. "Think he'll push?" the sergeant asked. "Only if it looks as though the pushing might succeed," Purbright said. They found Turner that afternoon at the back of the garage, where he was crouched over a dismantled radio with an expression of intense grievance, as though the device had personally offended him. Turner straightened when he saw them, wiping his hands on his trousers. He was shorter than Purbright had imagined, which seemed, in Turner's mind, to require a certain compensatory stiffness. "I haven't done anything," he said immediately. Purbright regarded him with interest. "I didn't ask if you had." Turner flushed. "Everyone's saying everyone is often wrong," Purbright said mildly. "You went to the parish hall yesterday?" "Yes." "You left early?" "Yes." "Why?" Turner shifted his weight. "I had to take something to my aunt." "What sort of thing?" "A box." Purbright waited. Turner's face took on the expression of a man mentally checking cupboards. It was personal. "Everything is," Purbright said. "Was it heavy?" "No." "Awkward?" "No." Turner's answers had the pleasing consistency of being unhelpful without being untrue. "Did you see the vicar's bicycle?" Lovegrove asked. "Yes." "Did you take it?" "No." Purbright watched Turner closely. There was no indignation there, no fear. Either, only irritation at being made part of a story he had not volunteered for. "What do you think happened to it?" Purbright asked. Turner snorted. "Someone borrowed it. Happens all the time. Only usually people put it back." "Did you borrow it?" "No." "Do you know who did it?" Turner hesitated. "I saw Councillor Bream fiddling with the lock." Lovegrove stiffened. "That's a serious thing to say." Turner shrugged. "He was bending down near it. Might have dropped something." Purbright filed the remark away without comment. He thanked Turner and left him to his radio, which now looked even more offended. Back outside, Lovegrove shook his head. "Now he's pointing at Bream." "Turner is being useful," Purbright said. "Not truthful, perhaps, but useful." They walked on. The afternoon had drawn a thin veil of cloud over the town, and the streets had acquired that particular quiet that came before tea and after decisions. Purbright noticed, as he often did, the small adjustments people made when they saw doors closing a little more firmly, voices lowering, faces arranging themselves into versions thought suitable for inspection. At the vicarage, Reverend Hatch was attempting to repair a hymn book with glue that had dried in the bottle. He looked up with relief at their arrival, as if the bicycle's absence had become a kind of background hum. "I've been thinking," he said earnestly. Perhaps it was a mistake to accept the umbrella. Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Why? It belonged to Mr. Dawkins," the vicar said. "He was particular about his things, about people borrowing them." "Did he lend his bicycle?" Purbright asked. "No," Hatch said quickly. "He never had one." "But he objected to borrowing," Purbright said. "Yes." "And you borrow bicycles," Purbright went on gently. "Occasionally." Hatch blinked, only when necessary. "If one leaves one somewhere and must get back," Purbright smiled. "Necessity is very persuasive." As they left, Lovegrove looked thoughtful. "You think the vicar borrowed something he shouldn't have?" "I think," Purbright said, "that someone borrowed something in order to borrow something else, and now they're wondering how to put it all back without being noticed." He paused at the gate, glancing down the lane where the bicycle had vanished. "In Flaxborough," he added, "being noticed is the real crime." The following day delivered a small but decisive alteration to the shape of events, the sort that did not announce itself as important, and therefore was. It arrived by way of Mrs. Peake. She came to the station just after 11, carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper and a sense of offended duty. She did not sit and she did not put the parcel down, as though it might escape if unobserved. "I found this," she said, placing it on Purbright's desk, with care that was almost accusatory. Purbright looked at it without touching it. "Where?" "In the parish hall cupboard, the one behind the stage. It was tucked right at the back, behind the trestles. I was putting things away properly, which no one else ever seems to manage." Lovegrove unwrapped the parcel. Inside was the vicar's umbrella. It was dry, clean, and closed with unnecessary neatness. Purbright regarded it for a long moment. "So it has come home," he said. "That's what troubles me," Mrs. Peake replied sharply. "Things don't come home on their own." "No," Purbright agreed. "They are returned." "And usually," she went on, "by someone who hopes very much that no one will notice." Purbright nodded. "Who had access to the cupboard?" Mrs. Peake sniffed. "Everyone and no one. Councillor Bream has a key. The electrical men were back and forth. The vicar, of course. Mrs. Dawkins came in briefly, though I don't see why she doesn't attend the fellowship. And there was that business with the school children rehearsing their little performance." Lovegrove looked up. "Mrs. Dawkins?" "Yes." "She said she'd left her gloves." "I don't think she had." Purbright thanked Mrs. Peake and watched her leave with the satisfied air of someone who had contributed to the order. When the door closed, he turned to Lovegrove. "An umbrella returned, but a bicycle did not," Lovegrove said. "That's odd." "It is selective," Purbright replied, "which makes it deliberate." They went to see Mrs. Dawkins again. She answered the door more slowly this time, as though she had been expecting them and had decided, at the last moment, to allow it. Her eyes flicked past them briefly, checking the street. "I didn't take it," she said before Purbright had spoken. "I didn't say you did," he replied. She stepped aside, letting them in. The front room looked unchanged, but Purbright noticed that the umbrella stand now held a different umbrella planer, newer and lacking history. "The vicar's umbrella has been found," he said. Mrs. Dawkins's mouth tightened. "I'm glad." "Where were you yesterday afternoon?" Purbright asked. "At home. And earlier I went to the hall. Why, I told you. I thought I'd left my gloves." "Did you find them?" "Yes." She did not look at him. Purbright nodded as if satisfied. "Did you see anyone in the cupboard?" "No." "Did you put anything there?" "No." Her answers were crisp, too crisp. Grief did that sometimes. So did pride. As they left, Lovegrove exhaled. "She's hiding something. Most people are," Purbright said. "The question is whether it matters." The answer arrived, as answers in Flaxborough often did, sideways. Councillor Bream summoned Purbright to the council offices that afternoon, his message brisk and official. When Purbright arrived, Bream was not alone. Reverend Hatch sat beside him, his hands folded, his expression a study in apologetic discomfort. "This has gone far enough," Bream said. "The umbrella has been found. The bicycle should be returned. We cannot have this hanging over the town." Purbright looked at the vicar. "Have you anything to add, Reverend?" Hatch hesitated. "I may have complicated matters," he said quietly. Bream stiffened. "Lionel, I borrowed something," the vicar continued doggedly, "before the flower show, something that was not mine." Purbright waited. "It was a set of ledger books," Hatch said, "old ones, belonging to Mr. Dawkins. They were stored in the parish safe years ago after a dispute about church funds. Mrs. Dawkins asked me to look at them, to see whether something had been misunderstood. Mrs. Dawkins, it seemed, had not misunderstood at all. The ledgers suggested that her husband had quietly covered shortfalls that no one else wished to acknowledge. The town had continued smoothly because someone had paid the difference. "I didn't want to carry them through the hall," Hatch said, "so I borrowed my bicycle to take them round the back. I meant to return it at once." "And the bicycle?" Purbright asked. Hatch sighed. "I left it at the garage. I went back for it later, but it had gone." Lovegrove frowned. "So someone borrowed the bicycle you borrowed?" "Yes." "And the umbrella?" Purbright asked. Hatch looked down. "Mrs. Dawkins followed me. She saw the ledgers. She took the umbrella instead. She said it felt balanced." Bream looked as though he might choke. Purbright considered this chain of borrowings, each polite, each justified, each nudging the town further into quiet disorder. "And who took the bicycle from the garage?" he asked. Hatch hesitated again. "Councillor Bream offered to return it for me. He said it would look better if it simply reappeared." Bream's face reddened. It was for the good of the town. "And where is it now?" Purbright asked. "At my house," Bream muttered. "In the shed." Purbright stood. "Then perhaps," he said gently, "we should all agree that borrowing is best conducted with fewer intermediaries." As he left, he reflected that the bicycle had been less a victim than a participant, passing through hands that all believed themselves considerate. It would come back, as it had gone, without drama, but the town would remember the unease and the ledgers and the umbrella, and adjust its manners accordingly. In Flaxborough, nothing was ever truly lost. It was merely misplaced among good intentions. The bicycle returned to the parish wall just after dawn, leaned with an almost exaggerated care against the same stone where it had first been missed. Its bell had been turned slightly inward, as though to reduce the chance of comment. Anyone passing early might have thought it had been there all along. By 9 o'clock, everyone had seen it. The manner of its return produced more talk than the disappearance itself. It was said to have been placed there in the night. It was said to have been wheeled back by a man who walked with purpose. It was said to have arrived in silence, which Flaxborough regarded as suspicious. Councillor Bream did not attend the council offices that morning, claiming a chill. Mrs. Peake opened the hall with a briskness that suggested moral victory. Reverend Hatch said nothing at all. Purbright arrived shortly before 11, when the morning had settled into its habitual calm, and the bicycle had become, once again, a fixture. He stood by it for a moment, not touching it, noting the fresh polish on the frame and the faint smell of oil that had not been there before. "You've been improved," he murmured. The vicar joined him, looking relieved and faintly chastened. "I was going to ring you," Hatch said. "It's back, quite intact." "So I see," Purbright replied. "And the shed?" Hatch blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Councillor Bream's shed," Purbright said mildly. "Empty!" The vicar coloured. "He brought it round very early. He said it would be best." Purbright nodded. "Best is a flexible word." They walked together towards the vicarage, where tea had been prepared in the manner of someone attempting normality with particular care. The umbrella stood once more by the door, its brass handle polished to a brightness that drew the eye. Mrs. Dawkins returned it, Hatch said, following Purbright's gaze, without comment. "Comment is rarely absent," Purbright said. "It is merely delayed." Over tea, the vicar spoke quietly about the ledgers. He did not defend his decision to borrow them, nor did he condemn Mrs. Dawkins for her part in the matter. He spoke instead of obligation of the small duties people took upon themselves without announcing them, and of how such duties hardened over time into expectation. She felt, he said, that the town owed her husband something it could never quite repay. "And the bicycle?" Purbright asked. Hatch smiled weakly. It became convenient. Purbright left him to his reflections and walked back through the town. He noticed that people now looked at him with a softened curiosity, as if reassured that the story had been tamed. The butcher nodded. Mrs. Larkin paused in mid-complaint. Even Turner, passing on his way to the garage, gave a brief, defensive grin. "You found it, then?" Turner said. "It found us," Purbright replied. At the garage, Lovegrove was waiting, his notebook closed. "Bream's been in," the sergeant said, "very keen to make sure we're satisfied." "And are we?" Purbright asked. Lovegrove hesitated. "No law broken, really, just borrowing." Purbright smiled. "Borrowing is the most common offence in Flaxborough." They walked together, and Lovegrove spoke of the things that had followed the bicycle's return. Mrs. Dawkins had been seen at the post office, unusually upright. Councillor Bream had sent a note to the vicar, phrased as an apology and read as a warning. The council had quietly agreed to review the handling of parish funds, though no one had said why. "And the town?" Lovegrove asked. "The town will adjust," Purbright said. "It always does." That afternoon, Purbright visited Mrs. Dawkins once more. She did not invite him in. They spoke on the step, the door held only partly open. "It's finished," she said, Purbright replied. She looked at him with a tired defiance. "He was a good man. I believe you," Purbright said, "and I believe he did what he thought necessary." She nodded once. "They will forget." "Some will," Purbright said, "some won't. But forgetting is also a habit." As he turned away, he saw Councillor Bream across the street, speaking earnestly to Mr. Gedge. Their heads bent together, their expressions grave. Bream caught Purbright's eye and straightened, as if reminded of posture. Later, back at the station, Purbright wrote his report with careful brevity. A bicycle temporarily removed. No evidence of theft. Matter resolved informally. He added nothing about umbrellas or ledgers or sheds. He paused before closing the file, considering whether to note the way the town had responded, how quickly it had chosen a suspect, how readily it had accepted an explanation that preserved dignity, and how the return of a familiar object had restored a sense of order disproportionate to its value. In the end, he wrote nothing of this. Such observations were not for reports, as evening settled, Flaxborough resumed its routines. The bicycle stood by the parish wall, unremarkable once more. People passed it without comment, which was itself a form of agreement. The town had been disturbed briefly and had closed ranks around its manners. Purbright locked his desk and put on his hat. He had a sense that the matter was not quite finished, not in the town's memory, at least, but that what remained would resolve itself quietly, in lowered voices and adjusted glances. He stepped outside into the cooling air, satisfied that the truth, such as it was, had been allowed to sit without being paraded. In Flaxborough, that was often as much justice as anyone required. The following days did not, as some had hoped, smooth themselves flat. Instead, they acquired a faint ripple, barely visible but persistent, as if something had passed beneath the surface and failed to settle. The bicycle's return had restored the town's appearance of order, but it had not restored its ease. People were careful now in ways they had not been before, and careful behaviour always suggested remembered risk. Purbright noticed it first in the conversations that stopped when he entered a room and then resumed with a slightly altered tone. He noticed it in the council minutes, which were longer than usual and said less. He noticed it in the Vicar's sermons, which circled obligation and charity with a new, faintly defensive precision. Most of all, he noticed it in Mrs. Dawkins. She had not withdrawn, as some might have expected. Instead, she appeared everywhere she was not required, her presence neat and unmistakable. She attended the market on days she had previously avoided. She lingered in the post office. She stood at the back of the church after evensong and spoke to people who were not accustomed to being addressed by her. "She's reminding them," Lovegrove said one afternoon, watching her cross the square, "of what they owe, of what she believes they—"
"Owe," Purbright corrected, "which is often more effective. The second incident, when it came, did not announce itself as such. It arrived disguised as a complaint. Mrs. Larkin came to the station with a grievance about her electricity bill, which she insisted had increased mysteriously. She had already spoken to the electrical shop and the council, and now she wished to speak to the police, as she believed that someone was interfering with the meter. "People think they can take liberties," she said darkly, "just because one lives alone." Purbright listened with care, asking questions that did not suggest he expected to find a criminal mastermind at work. When Lovegrove later followed up with the electrical shop, Mr. Gedge was irritated. "We didn't touch her meter," he said, "but someone's been into the cupboard behind the hall again, the one with the old fuse box, left it open." "Who would do that?" Lovegrove asked. Gedge snorted. "Anyone who thinks they've a right." Purbright went to
the hall himself. The cupboard door stood ajar, its contents undisturbed except for the ledger shelf, which was now empty. The ledgers had been moved, not stolen, Purbright suspected, but repositioned, returned perhaps to a place thought more appropriate. He stood for a moment in the quiet hall, imagining the act, the careful opening of the cupboard, the pause before touching something that had become symbolic, the satisfaction of restoring things according to one's own sense of order. He found Councillor Bream that evening, alone in his office, the blinds drawn. Bream looked up sharply as Purbright entered. "I thought we were finished with this," he said. "So did I," Purbright replied, "but the ledgers have been moved." Bream's mouth tightened. They were a nuisance, causing comments. Comment tends to arise when things are hidden, Purbright said. "They were hidden because they embarrassed people," Bream snapped, "including the church." "And Mrs. Dawkins?" Purbright asked. Bream looked away. "She has her version." Purbright leaned lightly against the desk. "You offered to help the vicar. You offered to help the town. You offered to help by returning a bicycle quietly. Now you've helped again." Bream straightened. "I acted in the town's interests." "Which interests?" Purbright asked. Bream did not answer. The next morning, Mrs. Dawkins called at the station. She did not sit. She placed her handbag carefully on the chair beside her, as if it deserved a place of its own. "They've taken them," she said. "The ledgers?" Purbright asked. "Yes." "Who?" She shook her head. "They think if they put things back where they belong, they'll stop meaning what they mean." "And do you agree?" Purbright asked. "No," she said simply. "I think it has a habit of travelling." She looked tired now, the effort of public uprightness showing at last. "My husband did not want thanks," she said. "He wanted fairness. And now?" Purbright asked. "Now I want them to stop borrowing my grief for their convenience?" Purbright nodded. "I think," he said, "that a polite conversation may be required." The conversation took place 2 days later in the vicarage sitting room, with tea served and biscuits offered, and declined according to preference and rank. Present were Reverend Hatch, Councillor Bream, Mrs. Dawkins, and Purbright. Lovegrove waited in the hall, listening to the muted rhythms of voices that never quite rose. Purbright spoke last. "It seems to me," he said mildly, "that the bicycle taught us something, not about theft, but about the way small borrowings can disguise larger ones. Reputation, responsibility, even silence, they all pass from hand to hand. Sometimes they are returned, sometimes they are not." Bream shifted. Hatch stared at his teacup. Mrs. Dawkins watched Purbright steadily. "The ledgers will be placed in the parish archive," Purbright went on, "open to inspection. The council will acknowledge the adjustments made years ago, quietly, and no one will borrow anything else without asking." Bream opened his mouth, then closed it. "Flaxborough," Purbright added, "is very good at pretending nothing has happened. It is less good at pretending forever. When the meeting ended, the town did not erupt. There were no raised voices, no declarations. The ledgers reappeared in their new place. A note appeared in the parish newsletter, brief and carefully phrased. Mrs. Dawkins stopped lingering quite so deliberately. Councillor Bream began attending the office again, and the bicycle remained by the wall, untouched. Purbright walked past it that evening, noting the way people now glanced at it, and then looked away, as if it had become a reminder rather than an object. He had the distinct sense that Flaxborough had learned something it would not articulate, and that this, too, would settle into habit. For the moment at least, the town was still. The weeks that followed settled into a cautious equilibrium, not quite peace, and not quite unease, but something that resembled manners being tried on for fit. The ledgers lay in the parish archive under a new label that described them as supplementary accounts, a phrase that managed to acknowledge and obscure in equal measure. People went to look at them singly, never in groups, and always at different times of day. No one stayed long. It was enough to know they were there, that they could be consulted, that they existed in the open rather than the cupboard. Mrs. Dawkins ceased her deliberate promenades through the town. She returned to a quieter pattern of days, though Purbright noticed that she no longer lowered her eyes when passing Councillor Bream. If anything, she inclined her head with a calm that suggested the matter was not closed so much as concluded on terms she could accept. Bream himself became unusually industrious. He attended meetings with punctuality, answered correspondence with care, and spoke often of transparency. The word began to appear with some frequency in council minutes, where it looked faintly out of place, like a guest who had arrived too early. Reverend Hatch continued his pastoral rounds with a renewed gentleness that seemed to carry a private edge. His sermons spoke of stewardship and forgiveness, but they also spoke, though less explicitly, of the dangers of convenience. Congregants listened with polite attention, each hearing a slightly different admonition. Through it all, Purbright observed without pressing. He had learned that Flaxborough responded best to stillness once the essential adjustments had been made. He contented himself with small inquiries that appeared casual, and were not. A question to the archivist about the handling of keys, a word with the hall caretaker about after-hours access, a visit to the garage where he asked Mr. Gedge in passing about Wilkes and Turner. "Turner's off to Lincoln," Gedge said. "Got himself a job that involves fewer errands." Purbright smiled. That may suit him. Gedge agreed. He always said this town was too memorable. The second disturbance, when it came, was so modest that it might have been overlooked had Purbright not been alert to modesty's possibilities. A notice appeared on the parish board, handwritten and unsigned, announcing a meeting to discuss the future handling of parish assets. The phrasing was careful, the handwriting neat, It was taken down within an hour, but not before being read by a dozen people who each read it slightly differently. Lovegrove brought it to Purbright's attention, the paper smoothed flat on the desk. "This feels like stirring," he said. "It feels like anxiety," Purbright replied. "Stirring usually follows." He went to see Mrs. Peake, who had discovered the notice and removed it with brisk disapproval. "People will start thinking they can put anything up," she said. "Next, it will be opinions." "Did you recognize the handwriting?" Purbright asked. Mrs. Peake hesitated. "It reminded me of the Dawkins receipts. Very precise, but—"
"That doesn't mean no," Purbright said. "It doesn't." Later that day, he encountered Mrs. Dawkins at the market. She was buying apples, examining each one as if it might argue with her. When she saw Purbright, she gave a small acknowledging nod. "I did not put up the notice," she said quietly. "I did not ask if you did," Purbright replied. She smiled faintly. "That seems to be your way." "It saves time," he said. She looked at the apples in her bag. "I wanted them to know that things cannot simply be moved and forgotten, that there is a process." "There is," Purbright agreed. "But processes work best when they do not appear accusatory." She sighed. "Accusation is often in the eye of the accused." They walked a little way together. "I will not pursue it," she said at last. "The notice, I mean." "Why not?" Purbright asked. "Because I have achieved what I needed," she replied. "They are careful now. Careful people rarely repeat themselves." That evening, Purbright found Councillor Bream waiting for
him at the station, his manner stiffly cordial. "I thought you should know," Bream said, "that I have suggested a formal review of parish procedures. Voluntary, of course." "Of course," Purbright said. Bream shifted. "One does not wish to be thought evasive." Purbright regarded him thoughtfully. "Evasion often begins as a wish not to inconvenience others." Bream did not respond. As Purbright walked home later, he passed the parish wall. The bicycle stood as ever, its basket empty, its bell untouched. A child paused beside it, examined it with interest, and then moved on, having decided it was not for him. The town, Purbright reflected, had reached the point where it could see the bicycle without needing it to explain anything. That was progress of a sort. At his desk that night, he made a brief note to himself, not in the case file but in the small notebook he kept for personal observations. It read only, "Borrowing reveals more than taking." He closed the notebook and turned out the light. Outside, Flaxborough settled into sleep, its streets quiet, its adjustments largely complete. There would be no more notices, no more borrowed bicycles, no more ledgers moved in the night. Or if there were, Purbright knew they would be handled with a new attentiveness. The town had learned that even small disturbances could echo, and that politeness, when misapplied, could become a kind of concealment. For now, at least, that knowledge rested lightly, like a bicycle returned to its place and left, deliberately, alone. Purbright had intended to leave matters where they were. That, he reflected, was often the most productive intention in Flaxborough. When a town believed a matter concluded, it supplied its own punctuation. People adjusted, habits softened, and the original disturbance sank into anecdote. It was a process that required time rather than force. What altered his mind was not a confession or a discovery, but a courtesy. It arrived in the form of a note, delivered by hand to the station late on a Wednesday afternoon. The envelope was unremarkable, the handwriting neat and uninsistent. Inside, the message was brief. "Inspector Purbright, I would be grateful if you would call at the vicarage tomorrow evening. There are one or two things it would be better to say aloud. L. Hatch." Purbright read it twice and placed it carefully in his pocket. Invitations phrased in that way usually followed a private decision already made. The vicarage was quiet when he arrived the next evening, the curtains drawn against the dusk, the front room lit with a single lamp that made the furniture look attentive. Reverend Hatch poured tea with deliberate calm and waited until Purbright had settled before speaking. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the bicycle." Purbright inclined his head. "I told myself that the matter was resolved," Hatch went on, "that the return of the object restored the balance. But I am not sure that balance is the same thing as truth." Purbright said nothing. Hatch took a breath. "I borrowed the ledgers because Mrs. Dawkins asked me to. I borrowed the bicycle because it was convenient. I accepted the umbrella because it seemed kind. In each case, I persuaded myself that the end justified the means." "And now?" Purbright asked. "And now I see that I allowed others to carry the weight of my discretion, Councillor Bream in particular." Purbright looked at him steadily. "Councillor Bream volunteered." "Yes," Hatch said, "but I accepted, and by doing so I gave him the opportunity to tidy things in his own way." He hesitated. "The town will forgive him, it always does, but I am not sure it understands what it forgives." "Do you?" Purbright asked. Hatch smiled faintly. "Better than I did." When Purbright left, he had the distinct sense that the vicar had not invited him merely to ease his conscience, but to set the stage for something else, something quieter, and therefore more consequential. The next morning, Councillor Bream asked to see him. He arrived without bluster, without authority, and without his usual briskness. He sat down at once, folded his hands, and spoke as if reciting something he had prepared and disliked. "I would prefer," Bream said, "to explain matters myself." Purbright nodded. "You may." Bream cleared his throat. "When the bicycle disappeared, I saw an opportunity. Not to take it, though I suppose, in a sense, I did, but to manage the situation. The town dislikes uncertainty. I thought I could remove it." "And did you?" Purbright asked. Bream's mouth tightened. "I replaced it with something else, with quiet pressure, with decisions made on behalf of others." "The ledgers," Purbright said. "Yes, they represented an inconvenience, a challenge to a narrative that had served us well." "Served whom?" Purbright asked. Bream did not answer immediately. When he did, it was soft. "Those of us who prefer things settled." Purbright leaned back. "You moved the ledgers because you believed they belonged somewhere less visible." "Yes." "And the bicycle?" Purbright prompted. Bream allowed himself a thin, humourless smile. It became a rehearsal. A way of seeing how easily objects, and with them meanings, could be returned without anyone asking too many questions. Purbright regarded him. "You intended the town to forget." "I intended the town to continue." "And if Mrs. Dawkins had not objected?" Bream looked away. "Then it would have." There was a silence that did not ask to be filled. At length Purbright said, "You have not broken the law." Bream nodded. "I know, but you have tested the town's patience," Purbright went on, "and its memory." Bream's shoulders sagged slightly. "What will you do?" Purbright considered. "Very little." Bream looked up, startled. "The town has already done what it will do," Purbright said. "The ledgers are accessible. The procedures are being reviewed." "You have been seen to explain yourself, which in Flaxborough is not the same as being forgiven, but it is a
Start? And my position? Bream asked. Purbright smiled faintly. Positions in this town are rarely lost in a single move. They are eroded. Bream absorbed this in silence. When he stood to leave, he looked smaller than he had before, as though authority had briefly been set aside. That afternoon, Purbright walked through the square. He saw Mrs. Dawkins speaking with Reverend Hatch, their conversation unremarkable to any passer-by. He saw Councillor Bream cross the street to avoid a group he would once have joined. He saw Mrs. Peake rearranging a notice board with renewed zeal. And he saw the bicycle. It stood where it always had, but now it seemed less like a fixture and more like a marker, an object that had travelled through the town's assumptions and returned, altered only in meaning. Purbright paused beside it and rang the bell once. The sound was small, apologetic, and immediately swallowed by the air. That, he thought, was as it should be. By evening, the town had begun
Adjust again, not to forget exactly, but to incorporate. Stories shifted slightly, emphases changed. The bicycle became, once more, simply the Vicar's. Purbright closed the file at his desk with quiet satisfaction. The matter had not ended with a reveal or a reckoning, but with an understanding shared unevenly and accepted gradually. In Flaxborough, that was enough resolution. After Councillor Bream's visit, Flaxborough entered what it liked to think of as its reflective phase. This was not a period of overt self-examination. No one gathered to admit error, and no speeches were made about lessons learned. Instead, reflection expressed itself through minor alterations in behaviour. Doors were closed more carefully, keys were returned more promptly. People asked permission for things they had once assumed were theirs by custom. Purbright watched these adjustments with the detached patience that had become second nature to him. He had no interest in pressing the town beyond the point at which it wished to be pressed. In Flaxborough, pressure applied too directly produced stubbornness, and stubbornness had a long memory. The bicycle remained untouched. Reverend Hatch resumed riding it on his rounds, though he now locked it with deliberate ceremony, even when stopping for only a moment. He did so not out of fear, but out of respect for the fact that objects, like confidences, deserved to be handled openly. People noticed this. They noticed most things. Mrs. Dawkins attended church the following Sunday and sat in her usual place, but she did not leave immediately after the final hymn. Instead, she remained behind to speak with the vicar, her manner composed, her voice low. Those who observed them from a distance could not have said what passed between them, only that the exchange ended with a nod from each and a sense that something had been settled, if not erased. Councillor Bream, for his part, did not resign, nor was he asked to. He continued to attend council meetings, but he spoke less often and listened more. When he did speak, he chose his words with care that bordered on caution. The word transparency appeared less frequently in his vocabulary, replaced by procedure, which suited him better. Purbright encountered him one afternoon in the square, both men pausing at the same moment to allow a delivery lorry to pass. Bream inclined his head. "Inspector," he said. Councillor Purbright replied. There was a pause in which something might have been said and was not. Bream looked relieved when the moment passed. At the station, Lovegrove remarked on the change. "It's quiet," he said. "It is," Purbright agreed. "Too quiet?" Purbright smiled. "Quiet is only suspicious when it follows noise. This is an adjustment." The final movement of the affair came, fittingly, without witnesses. One evening, Purbright received a small envelope through the post, addressed in the vicar's careful hand. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Inspector, I have arranged for a brief note to be placed in the parish records regarding the supplementary accounts. It does not assign blame, nor does it offer praise. It states only what occurred and why. I believe that is enough." With thanks, L. Hatch, Purbright folded the letter and placed it in the file, though he did not add it to the official record. It belonged to the margins rather than the centre. The next morning, Mrs. Peake removed an outdated notice from the parish board and replaced it with a new one announcing the annual fete. There was no mention of assets, bicycles, or meetings. Life, in Flaxborough's estimation, had moved on. Purbright took a longer walk than usual that afternoon, passing through streets where he had conducted his inquiries weeks earlier. The town looked unchanged, the same shop windows, the same pavement cracks, the same habitual routes traced by people who rarely questioned them. Yet he was aware, in the way one sometimes was only afterwards, that something had shifted. The bicycle, he knew, would never again be quite invisible. Neither would the cupboard behind the stage, nor the parish archive, nor the quiet assumptions that had once governed who was allowed to decide what was best for whom. These things would not be spoken of openly, but they would be remembered, and memory in Flaxborough was a form of regulation. As he passed the parish wall, he paused once more by the bicycle. It bore the marks of use now, a little dust on the frame, a faint scrape on the basket where it had brushed against something. It was, in other words, fully itself again. A passer-by nodded to him, another smiled briefly and moved on. No one lingered. That evening, Purbright completed his report. He wrote it with care, noting the sequence of events without embellishment. A bicycle was removed and returned, no charges laid. Matters resolved through discussion and adjustment. He used the language of conclusion without the language of triumph. Before closing the file, he added a final line, not required but accurate. The disturbance revealed no criminal intent but considerable civic sensitivity. He considered this, then left it as it was. As he locked the desk, Lovegrove hovered in the doorway. "That's it, then?" the sergeant asked. "Yes," Purbright said, "as far as it goes." "And where does it go?" Lovegrove pressed. Purbright put on his hat. "Into habit," he said. "Everything in Flaxborough does." They stepped outside together into the early evening, the air mild, the streets settling. Somewhere a bicycle bell rang briefly and then did not ring again. The town absorbed the sound and returned to itself, altered just enough to be different, and just enough to believe it was the same. The last thing to settle was not an object or a document, but a manner. Purbright recognized it on a mild afternoon when the market square was busy without being hurried, and people moved with the careful ease of those who had learned, where not, to tread. It was present in the way conversations were conducted now, still polite, still indirect, but with a faint new honesty beneath the surface, like a floorboard that had been lifted and replaced with better nails. He stood for a time near the parish wall, watching the bicycle receive its share of indifference. A boy wheeled his own machine past it without slowing. An elderly man paused, considered the vicar's basket with brief approval, and went on. The bicycle had returned to its proper state of invisibility, which was, Purbright reflected, the highest compliment Flaxborough could offer. Reverend Hatch approached from the direction of the High Street, walking rather than riding. He stopped when he saw Purbright and smiled with a warmth that had lost its earlier defensiveness. "I thought I might find you here," he said. "I find it useful," Purbright replied, "to see how things stand when no one is explaining them." Hatch nodded. "They stand better than I expected." They walked together for a little way, the vicar speaking of small matters, the success of the fete, the improvement in the choir's punctuality, the way Mrs. Peake had at last conceded that the hall cupboard could remain unlocked if keys were signed for. It was all inconsequential and therefore important. "I have apologized," Hatch said quietly as they reached the vicarage gate. Purbright glanced at him. "To whom?" "To those who needed it," Hatch said, "and to one or two who did not, but who benefited from hearing it." Purbright smiled faintly. "Apologies have a way of travelling." "They do," Hatch agreed, "like bicycles." He left Purbright there, and Purbright continued on alone. At the council offices, Councillor Bream was in conversation with a clerk, his voice measured, his gestures restrained. When he saw Purbright, he did not avoid him this time, nor did he seek him out. He nodded once, a simple acknowledgment, and returned to his papers. It was enough. Mrs. Dawkins was seated on a bench, nearby, her shopping bag at her feet. She looked up as Purbright passed. "They've put a note in the records," she said. "I went to see." "And," Purbright asked. "It tells the truth," she replied, plainly. "That is not always comfortable," Purbright said. "No," she agreed. "But it allows one to stop watching." She gathered her bag and rose, her movements unhurried. "My husband would have approved," she added after a moment. "He disliked fuss." Purbright inclined his head. "So do I." As evening drew in, the town softened. Lights came on behind familiar windows. The butcher closed his shop with a deliberate ceremony. Somewhere, a radio played softly, the tune indistinct and agreeable. Back at the station, Purbright sat at his desk and opened the file one last time. He read through his notes without changing a word. They recorded a sequence of borrowings and returns, of discretion offered and withdrawn, of authority exercised and quietly adjusted. They did not record the tone in which these things had occurred, nor the subtle shifts of posture and voice that had mattered more than the acts themselves. He closed the file and placed it in the cabinet. Lovegrove lingered in the doorway. "That really is it, then?" he said. "Yes," Purbright replied. "As much as things ever are?" Lovegrove hesitated. "Funny business when you think of it. All that over a bicycle." Purbright looked up. The bicycle was convenient, he said. It allowed everyone to talk about something simple while thinking about something else. Lovegrove considered this. "And now?" "And now," Purbright said, standing and putting on his hat, "they will talk about other things with a little more care." They stepped outside together. The air was cool, the street lamps steady. Purbright paused, listening to the town's evening sounds, the distant clink of crockery, the murmur of voices, the brief ring of a bell from somewhere he could not see. He walked home at an unhurried pace, content that no further action was required. Flaxborough had absorbed the disturbance and adjusted its habits accordingly. There would be no announcement of this fact, no marker placed to denote the change. It would reveal itself only in hindsight, in the way such towns always revealed their lessons. At the parish wall the bicycle waited, unremarkable and complete. Purbright passed it without stopping. Behind him the town continued as it always had, its routines intact, its manners restored, and its small instructive secret folded neatly into memory, ready to be recalled, if ever needed, by those who now knew where to look.